Well, good morning. It is great having you with us for our new series, Foodie. We're looking at how to taste and savor the different tastes of life. Today, we're specifically looking at salt and the role salt plays in bringing flavor, but also preserving food. So with me today is my friend Philip. Philip, you're a professional chef with FCC, and you also attend our church, and we asked you to make something really built on salt today. What do you got for us?
So today we're doing a salt-baked rainbow trout. You can do this application for steaks. You can do this for different types of fish.
Yeah, and how do you know the difference between good fish and bad fish?
One of the best ways to find out if a fish is good or bad by giving it a little kiss.
Drew, is it Drew in the building? Yeah.
You can tell if a fish is fresh by the cloudiness or how clear their eyes are.
Wow.
So if it's cloudy eyes, then I would
find a new fish.
Yeah,
find a new fish. Okay. All right. So we're starting with egg whites. You said. So you need the small bowl or the big bowl?
Small bowls, please.
All right, small bowl.
Both of them.
There's one and there's two.
Thank you.
I'll be your Vanna White here.
Excellent. So we're going to grab our salt. If you can start opening that while we're talking.
Yeah. Yep.
But a good rule of thumb: this is a 2-pound box of salt. So I'm going to use 2 eggs, but only the yolks of the eggs.
Okay.
So that's a good rule of thumb there. So we're going to separate the whites from the yolks, and there's 2 different ways you can do it. It's back and forth with the shells.
Nice.
Or you can just, and I'm not going to do it, you can just put it right into your hand and use that as a sieve.
Oh, wow. I've never seen anybody do that.
So it's a little more gentle that way, and you're less likely to break the yolk. I'm going to do a little whisk, try and break it up a little bit, create 1 as opposed to 2. So this is going to be set aside.
Yep.
Now we're going to get our aromatics, our herbs, our lime, lemongrass, and a little bit of ginger. For this particular application, we do not need to peel the ginger.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And this is just going to be infusing the flavor of the ginger into the fish as well then?
Correct.
Okay.
Right, and what that is doing is that's just, again, giving more exposure to the ginger and allowing some of those fibers to be exposed, and that just creates more flavor and releases more flavor.
Okay, you're putting it inside of it. That's interesting. Yeah.
Go inside here. We're going to take a couple things of lime. So a lot of times when you're cooking with cilantro or parsley, you'll try and just use the leaves, right?
Yeah, it can break off all the stems. Yeah.
For this application, you want some of the stems because honestly, a lot of the flavor that you get, the bold flavor, you get from stems.
Oh, it comes from that. I didn't realize that. Okay. And same thing, it's all stuff we're going to kind of pack inside the thing?
Correct.
Okay. Is that all going to be pulled out when you go to eat it?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. So this is purely just infusing it with flavor from the inside out.
Correct. Now, lemongrass is very foreign to a lot of people.
Yeah, I don't know.
Lemongrass itself, I mean, it does have a little element of lemon to it, but one of the best things that lemongrass does is it really just lightens the flavor. It just gives it an airy kind of light. It's hard to explain, but it just really lightens up the dish. We're gonna put that guy there off to the side. Now, we're gonna take our salt.
All right.
And we're gonna take our egg yolks. I'm gonna grab this guy here.
Yep.
I'm going to pour
all right, but how much salt? That's a lot of salt. So how much salt, how do you ratio that to the amount of fish you have?
So it's kind of just visual, right, depending on the size. So this is a 2-pound box of salt, and I'd say this is probably close to an 8-ounce fish.
Okay.
You want to make sure to have enough salt that you're really going to be able to create the full casing without any holes or cracks.
Yeah, and this is going to both be flavor to it, but also you said it's going to actually encase this thing in a way that allows it to cook. So tell me about that.
So we are creating basically a giant steamer.
Okay.
For it, a tomb, if you may.
Okay.
So we are going to add the yolks.
And how do you know kind of the ratio? You just, I mean, you've probably done this much times as far as ratio of the amount of wipes to salt. You just kind of get a feel for it, and if it's not wiped in, you add more, or do you just grab what's off the top, or what's kind of your rule of thumb there?
Yeah, about 1 egg white per pound of salt.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay.
So that seems to be a good ratio that I've found there.
Nice.
And this all can kind of go off to the side for now. And we're going to get our quarter sheet tray.
Okay.
We're gonna add.
All right, prepare the tomb here, the steamer. The salt steamer. All right.
And we want to have enough on here that we're gonna keep the fish off of the sheet tray.
So the tomb goes all the way around. I see. Yeah. Yeah.
And then the fish is not directly onto the metal.
Okay, great.
This is another. So we got our guy here. And we're just going to continue.
Well, you can see that would bring a lot of flavor.
Absolutely.
So tell me how it acts as a steamer there. What do you mean by a steamer exactly? And what's kind of the secret to make sure it steams properly as you're doing this?
So as we put the salt on here, remember that this has the egg whites in it.
Yeah.
So as this starts to cook, the egg whites bind all the salt flakes together.
Yeah.
And creates that encasing, creates that tomb. So.
And what happens if you miss a spot?
If you miss a spot, then you're just going to have a location that's going to let that steam out.
So it's cooking in, you're not getting full pressure. Great.
So
well, this looks great.
Might not cook as even.
Yeah. All right, and by the way, if you're interested in the recipe for this, it's actually in the QR codes, both in your program, as well as we'll put that on the screen as well for you. So you can just take a picture of that if you want to try this at home. So, okay, what's the next step? We got it all set. What do we do next?
Next step is to put it in the oven.
All right.
Now, what we didn't mention at the very beginning is set your oven at 400 degrees to preheat.
Okay, 400. Okay.
400.
Okay, it's been 30 minutes, you said?
30 to 35
30 minutes. There it
minutes.
comes out. Wow, nice golden brown.
Yeah, so you want the internal temperature to be about 135 degrees of the fish.
Okay.
And when temping, you always temp at the thickest part.
Oh,
right?
gotcha.
You don't want to go to the tail and be like, oh, but it's 160.
Sure, yeah.
So now we're going to get back to our favorite spoon.
Okay, favorite spoon.
After this comes out of the oven, you're going to take it and you're just going to crack it.
Okay.
So this guy, you can see, it's really hard there.
It's got like a crust. Yep. Oh, I see, like the pieces chunk off. Yeah.
Yes.
Again, almost like snow that it's rained on top of. You get chunks of it coming up. That's interesting.
Absolutely.
Good. And then are you scraping off the skin as well then?
Yes. So when you eat it, you're going to want to scrape all that skin off.
Nice.
And then you start to break it out.
Well, that's awesome. And then from there, you're going to pull out the ingredients from the inside because the flavors are there.
Skin comes right off.
Okay, look at that. Wow.
Peel it off, and it's best served family style.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, man, you can see today as we look at the role salt plays, salt, as you said, it gets flavor to it, but also preserves it. And that's what we're going to find out from Margaret Feinberg, who's with us today. She's going to talk about the role salt played all through history and how it applies to our life and be able to preserve and add taste to our life as well.
Thank you. Nice job, guys. That was awesome. And I kind of want that pot and pan whole setup at my house so I can just go wild. It's awesome. It is such a joy to be back with you here at Horizon. I have missed you guys, and I'm really glad you're here today. It's pretty awesome. So in this series, it has been just such a gift. If you haven't followed along, you can jump online and see the last two kind of like episodes in this series on savoring the taste of life. And it's worthwhile because not only were Chad and Drew awesome, but also there are some more killer recipes that you can just work into your repertoire, which is fabulous. But when I was invited to come, part of the reason is that because the last maybe 15 years, I have been studying food within the ancient text in the Bible. And this hunger to kind of understand this is something that has just drove me to dive into this book and just say, well, what does this look like? What does this feel like? And what I begin to discover is if you start to read this book, you'll find that food, it's like it pops and sizzles on almost every page. Do we have any fans of the Food Network here? Yeah, yes. Do we have any fans of Rachel Ray, Bobby Flay, Chick-fil-A? Right? Like all of those things. And so this hunger to kind of know this book and to understand food has taken me all over the country and really the world. I went and I spent time with a shepherdess up in Oregon. I traveled to Napa Valley to pluck grapes. I went to Madera, California to learn about figs. I cold called one of the heads of Yale's religious school, and I introduced myself, and I talked about the project I was working on, and then I just, invited myself to his house to bake bread for an afternoon, because that's what normal people do, and serial killers. Like, I even went over to Israel and I fished in the Galilee, and I got invited to spend time with a family in Croatia and bring in an olive harvest and learn about olive oil from a family who had been raising and nurturing those trees for literally generation after generation, hundreds of years. And with each person, I would kind of open up this book and I would say, hey, how do you read this passage, not as some like big fancy theologian, but in light of what you do every day? And their answers changed the way that I read this book forever. Time and time again, I found myself asking, how have I grown up in a religious context? How have I studied this book? Have I listened to so many teachings on this book? How have I downloaded so many podcasts? And nobody has told me these things. This journey became the foundation for two different books, one called Taste and See, and the other called Scouting the Divine, My Search for God in Wine, Wool, and Wild Honey. Because we all need some extra alliteration in our lives. And this started to shift the way that I encountered food, how I gathered around a table, how I thought about the particulars of what is nourishing us and how we are nourished both by God but also with each other. And so today, I want to zero in on one particular food, and it's one that I would argue that possibly, like, if it did not exist, I might not exist. You see, I was raised by a Jewish father who back in the 1950s developed longboards the very first time surfing was becoming a thing. And he would cruise up and down the coast of the East Coast, and he would go into various stores and try to sell his surfboards and introduce them. And as he is going along one particular day, he walked into a little surf shop and he saw a really cute gal who caught his eye. And so he was a little nervous and a little awkward, but he thought, you know what we have in common? We have surfing. And so he went up to her and he just started conversing with her and asking questions. And he really wanted to invite her to dinner, but he didn't know how. And so he just said, hey, if you'll go to dinner with me tonight, I'll give you a discount on any surfboard you want. And so surprisingly, this woman said yes, and they went out to dinner. And as part of the appetizer, she ordered a bowl of soup. And she grabbed the salt and she just started salting the soup. And she was caught up in telling this story that was a little bit long. And she's going, and my father's eyes are getting wider and wider. And he doesn't know whether to interrupt her or what to do, when suddenly the lid of the salt shaker pops off, splashes in the soup, salt goes everywhere. And that woman thought, there is no way I am getting a second date. But something about that moment and that woman just kind of caught my dad's attention and kept it. And so this is a photo of my mom and dad celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. And they still tell that story and chuckle to this day. So arguably, without salt, I would not exist. But neither would you. Salt is found in our sweat and in our saliva and in our tears. If you're injured and you go to the hospital, one of the first things they will do is hook you up to a saline bag. Physiologically, salt is crucial to transmit nerve impulses and to stimulate muscles. If all of the salt was drained from your body, your heart would cease to beat. Now, we live in an age where salt is just so common and so accessible and so inexpensive that we don't think about it a lot. I mean, consider if you went down to Skyline and you ordered something, you said, hey, could I get some salt here? And they said, there will be an upcharge for that. You would probably think, what is going on here? But that has not been the case for most of human history. It was actually the Egyptians who first discovered the power and the potential of salt. They learned that if they would harvest the salt from the Nile Delta, and they would take a fish, like we saw in the recipe, or a piece of meat, and they would make thin cuts in it, and they would add the salt, then all of a sudden that incredibly valuable and precious food source that once went bad in 24 or 36 hours, it would now last 24 to 36 months. And that was a game changer and a moment in history where there was no refrigeration. But it wasn't just the Egyptians who loved salt. The Romans were so passionate about salt that they actually built a road called the Salt Road into the center of their empire. Why did they care so much about salt? Because the Romans, who ruled during the time of Jesus, was primarily an empire that grew through military force. And any of you who have served in the military, we are so grateful for your service. But as they sent their soldiers out on the battlefield, they began to notice that if the salt was not replenished in their bodies, then they would experience confusion, seizures, even permanent brain damage. And so in Rome, they began including salt and how they took care of their soldiers. And in fact, in Latin, the word sal is where we get the word salt from. So that is actually where we get the word salary from, meaning one who is paid in salt. It's the etymology of words like salad, vegetables seasoned with salt, or sausage, which is just simply meat seasoned with salt. And I think that it is this kind of historical background that helps illuminate just how important salt is. For any history buffs in the room, Napoleon reached a point in a battle where he was struggling because they had no access to salt. And without the access to salt, his soldiers' wounds, they just wouldn't heal. For those of you who love the Civil War, the Union Army was very intense on fighting as hard as they needed to win one particular town in Virginia. Its name? Saltville, because they knew how essential that salt was for the war. And so apart from salt, we simply cannot live. And I think it's this historical context that just begins to add some depth. When Jesus makes a declaration in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, when he simply says this, he says, "You are the salt of the earth." And so in order to understand this, I decided to travel about 150 miles south of our home in Utah to a place where it was an ancient seabed that was frozen in time, a place called the Redmond Salt Mine. And when I arrived, I was greeted by a 50-something man by the name of Neil, who was so kind and jovial, who was the kind of guy who would give Mr. Fred Rogers a little run on his money. And so we are talking, and he invites me to go into the salt mine. And of course, I jump at the opportunity. He hands me a hard hat. We climb into a truck, and he begins driving toward the back of the property, where this mouth of the cave, it's like it just swallows us whole as we drive in. And I can see the salt stalactites dripping from the ceiling. And we continue to drive, and the road keeps splitting, and there are gates, and we go right on one and left on another and right. And somewhere in there, he said, pay attention to which path we take, because if something were to collapse or happen, you've got to figure out how to get out of here. And I am thinking, I am very directionally challenged, and this is not going to go well. But after driving for some time, we came to a depth of 410 feet within the salt mine. All of a sudden, there was this large equipment before us, and Neil flashed the lights of the truck twice, and all of a sudden, the machinery stopped. He nodded at me and said, it's safe to get out. And I opened the door of the truck, and as I did, I breathed in, and it smelled like the sweet morning of being near the ocean. When I climbed down out of the truck, suddenly I was not just surrounded by salt on the ceilings and the walls of this cave, but beneath, it was like walking on a beach. And as I'm looking down, I'm noticing in the light that there are salt little particles that are falling like snow. I immediately reached down and I scooped up a large portion of salt, and kind of being that person who goes to Costco or Sam's Club or really anywhere and can't not try the samples, I was like, ooh, I've got to try this. And so I took a little bit of pinch of the salt, and it didn't taste like any other salt I'd ever had. Like it had more dimension to it, and it almost had this sweet finish. Neil then, he waved me over to the side of the cave, and he said, Margaret, you've got to see this. And as I'm walking over, the salt particles are still falling, and the side of the cave just has this thin layer of these salt particles all over it. And Neil takes his hand and he brushes all of that salt away. And what is now a wall of salt in such incredible beauty. It's the color of peach garnets and of tan and white quartz. And in the truck's light is such glistening beauty. And to think that a creator God would have established such beauty, not just in the solar system and in the sky and on the earth that we conceive, but even in the crevices deep within the earth and inside of you and of me. Well, Neil said, hey, we've actually shut down the mine by having you here, so we got to get out of here. And so we climbed back up into the truck, and we began driving our way out. When we got back, I remember Neil said, I've got a piece of the salt that I'd like to give you. And I was like, that would be amazing. And so he sent me one home with one of the pieces from the Redmond Salt Mine. Would anybody here like to see that? Let me show you real quick. This is some of the salt in its form from the Redmond Salt Mine. And if you look at it, you can see kind of with the light that it glistens, and the more that you polish it or rub off the salt particles, that it becomes brighter and brighter and more glistening. And the red hues here are actually from the iron, and the dark brown hues are from the magnesium. And there's more than 60 different minerals within here that our bodies need in order to be healthy. And so when you grind this up, it looks like a pink Himalayan salt. But what's fascinating is that you don't have to go to the other side of the world or order it from that region. This kind of salt exists here in our own nation. And so as I am looking at this and I am studying it, I begin to think, well, what does this have to do with salt in the Bible and with Jesus' declaration? Well, when Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth, he was never referring to the massively refined, chemically altered, fortified with iodine since 1924 for the reason of goiters, kind of salt that often graces our tables. Rather, when he was saying, you are the salt of the earth, He was saying, just like that salt, you are somebody who has been hewn, you have been brought forth from your particular geography, from your particular upbringing, from your particular place and time and in history. And that God has formed you with your unique personality and strengths and weaknesses and quirks, and that God wants to use all of that as he pours you out as the salt of the earth. And so when we look at Jesus' declaration that you are the salt of the earth, we have to consider this historical and cultural background, particularly when those living in antiquity first heard these words. You see, I think that when those who were listening to Jesus declare those words, when they heard him say, "You are the salt of the earth," they recognized that Jesus was saying, "You are a preserving agent." That just as salt is placed in those layers of fish or meat like it was with the Egyptians, that God has taken you and placed you in this time, in this slice of history, in this moment as preserving agents. To preserve what? The ways and the life, the generosity and the grace and the kindness and the love of Jesus Christ. And so, as we are preserving agents, those in antiquity would have also heard Jesus' teaching and recognized something that we all know today. And that is, as the salt of the earth, you are also a flavoring agent. That everywhere you go, you are called to bring the flavor of heaven down here to earth. That where there is bitterness, you offer forgiveness. That where there is sourness, you deliver sweetness. That what they taste is the goodness and the graciousness of a loving God. Just this past weekend, I heard a story from a friend about her son-in-law who had gone out to the lake in the spring. And he was so excited. It was a glistening, just gorgeous day. And so he brought his 3 kids who were littles, and he brought a ton of friends, and they climbed in the boat. And it felt like it was heavy. It felt like it was pretty sunk down, but he just reasoned, it's because there's just so many people in here. And so he took off, and they're going, and they're laughing, and they're having a great time until he gets to the far end of the lake. And suddenly he's like, man, something still is not right. And so he looks down and he looks around and he realizes that the boat is flooding with water. And he had left the plug back on the dock. And so he turns around and he tries to gun it to get back to the dock on the far side of the lake, but it's slow with all the people in there. And he's just trying to keep it afloat and keep going and get everybody back to safety. But before he can get to the dock, there's a large area of the lake that is marshaled off as a no-wake zone. And so as he enters, as fast as he can go into that no-wake zone, all of a sudden, people just start yelling at him. They're saying, "Slow down, you're going too fast." One person is yelling obscenities, another is waving at him with one finger. And this guy has no options. But there was one person on a boat that day who yelled out, "Do you need help?" And the guy's like, "Yeah." He says, "How can we help?" And he brought his boat alongside this guy's, was able to deboard a ton of the people on his boat so he could safely make it back to the dock. And the question is simply today, in this moment, in this slice of history, how are you living? Are you looking at people who maybe are causing your boat to rock a little bit? You're feeling the rock and those waves. For others of you, maybe you're seeing people aren't doing the things that you would do them in the same way that you would do them. For others of you, you're looking out and you're mad by what you see. Are you yelling out obscenities? Are you yelling out and trying to tell people what to do when you could simply be asking, "Do you need help? How can we help?" And sidle up beside them in such a way that brings safety, grace, and provision in their moment of need. And so as the salt of the earth, those who listened to Jesus knew that he was saying that you are a preserving agent and a flavoring agent, but they recognized that there was something more. You see, Jesus makes this interesting observation, and he starts to unpack this. He makes this in Greek 6-word declaration that you are the salt of the earth in Matthew, in something called the Sermon on the Mount. But also a slight variation of that is in the Gospel of Luke, known as the Sermon on the Plain. And that 6-word declaration is followed in Greek by about a 20-word warning. And this little translation of this is slightly different than what you'll see on the screen. But Jesus continues and said, "Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out." That translation says dunghill. And I'd read this a lot, and I just kind of struggled with it because I'd never noticed that detail, that there's a connection between salt and both the soil and the dunghill or the manure. And so being super curious, I just started to research, to dive into the conversation with Neil, and it turns out that it's not just humans that need salt, plants need it too. Now, those of you who are gardeners know that if you just go out with a big old large bag of salt and you dump it on your flower bed or on your lawn, you are going to kill everything and nothing is going to grow well. But here's what's interesting, that if you go out with just the right amount of salt, that vegetation will naturally flourish. It's why if you go to a hardware store and buy something like Miracle-Gro, you will notice that the primary ingredient, or one of them, is sodium chloride. It's why even to this day in the Dead Sea in Israel, one of the primary exports is fertilizer, salt. And so that explains the soil, but what about the manure? Well, my husband Leif, you see by the book table, he's the love of my life, man. I adore that guy. But we have a very cute dog by the name of Zoo. Here's a picture of him. By the way, so first of all, he weighs in at 4 pounds, 4 ounces. I would also let you know that if you name a dog or have a choice of a name, maybe don't name it Zoom, because you will be running around chasing him the whole time. Don't name your dog Rogue, because he's going to go rogue. Nobody told me this, and I wish they had. But we live in a ski town, and it snows heavily, and this last winter was insane. Most snow on record everywhere. And what happened is when the snow melted, we discovered all of Zoom's little deposits all over the yard that had been collecting for about 6 months. And what I learned in research is that if I were to go out there with a little bit of salt on each one and add it, it would change the manure so that it didn't just rot, but it actually broke down in such a way that the nutrients were preserved, and it would cause the vegetation to flourish. And so when Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth," he was not just talking about table salt, he was talking about fertilizer salt. So my hunch is this morning when you came to Horizon, you had no idea that you were going to get a history lesson, a science lesson, a Bible lesson, and a lesson on poop. But as the salt of the earth, you are not just preserving agents. You are not just flavoring agents. You are agents of human flourishing. Wherever you go, you are called to foster new life, to help people grow into the fullness of all God has for them. That where there is weakness, you bring strength. That where there is despair, you bring hope. And that where there is death, you speak life. Because Jesus says you are the salt of the earth. You are an agent of preserving, flavoring, and human flourishing. And often the places that Christ or God nudges us toward, they're the hard places. Like your conscience will be like, "Oh, I really need to do that." And there'll be some sort of resistance. Those places are often stinky, messy, and sometimes the last places or the last people that we ever want to serve. But it's not just celery and salad and sausage that find their Latin root in salt. The word for salvation is derived from the same Latin root as salt. It is your saltiness that brings salvation to a lost, hungry, and dying world. Some time ago, I met a woman named Susan. She was so lovely. And she described her son and was just bragging on him. It was so fun to listen to a mama brag on their kid. You just see her glow in her eyes. But as she was talking about him, she said how he had gone to this church and she'd just seen some cool changes in his life, like just making better decisions. And she said, but one summer, a few years later, he got a job at a construction company and he was working on the crew. And one day, out of a freak accident, a large piece of equipment fell and hit him on the head. They rushed him to a hospital. Susan got there as fast as she could. When she saw the doctors, they assured her it was going to be okay. But 5 days later, he died. And Susan described that he was so stinking angry at God. She was so mad that this had happened, that she had lost her precious son. And she described this day about 6 months later where she went up into her son's bedroom. She hadn't touched anything. She or her husband, there was this thin layer of dust that covered everything. And she said in that place, she just began to weep. She was just so overcome with the grief. And as the tears flow, it became like almost this wailing until she described that she actually fell down on the floor and she took her hands and she beat them against the carpeting as strong as she possibly could until she was exhausted. And in that place, she said she knew that she had a decision to make. She could continue on the path that she was on and become a bitter, angry old woman. Or she could choose to become a follower of Jesus and ask him by his grace and love to do what she could not do on her own. She described that she got off of that carpet that day a different woman. She soon started going to the church that her son had attended. And all of a sudden, her husband started to notice something different about her, something good, something that was just shining out of her that he couldn't ignore. And so he started going to that church, and then he decided to become a follower of Jesus. But Susan was this kind of woman who just kept remaining suspicious that God was up to something good. And so despite everything, she just kind of felt this conscience, this nudge, so to speak, to reach out through LifeLink, the organization that had coordinated her son's organ transplants, to reach out to all those people. She couldn't reach out directly. She had to go through the organization. And so she never knew where those letters went, but she sat down and she wrote dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And do you know, of all the people who received those organs, only one chose to write back. And it was the young man who had received her son's heart. And so Susan starts exchanging letters, phone calls. Eventually they meet up a few times, and Susan, just being her, talking about her faith, all of a sudden that young man decides to become a follower of Jesus too. And she shared this picture with me. This is a picture of Susan with that young man. And I don't know what you see in that image, but I see a mama who got to hear her son's heart beat again. You see, we are a people who remain suspicious that even in the pain, even in the darkness, that just perhaps God can work things together, that God can bring about good even when it seems impossible. And so that gift of salvation, which just is a fancy word for saying rescue, God offers all of us. And it's a beautiful gift should we choose to respond. But my question for you today is simply, how are you living your life? It's dicey out there, guys. It's toxic, it's polarizing, and the divides in our nation are wider than it's ever been. It's so easy to make snap judgments, to write people off, to say no. to make distance in relationships, give up on friendships that have been there for many years of our life. But my question is simply, how are you living? Are you living as the one who is watching someone rock your boat, go through a no-wake zone, and yelling out yells and screams and obscenities and giving people the bird and an ain't a pet parakeet? Or are you the person who's crying out to others, do you need help? How can we help? And being part of rescuing others individually and as families and as communities, that they may get safely to the shore. May you be the latter, and may you go forth as the salt of the earth.
I don't want to hear anymore. Teach me to listen. I don't want to see anymore. Give me a vision that you could move this heart to be set apart. I don't need to recognize the man in the mirror, 'cause I don't want to trade your plan for something familiar. I can't waste a day, and I can't stay the same. I wanna be different, I wanna be changed. So all of me is gone, and all that remains is a fire so bright the whole world can see that there's something different. So come and be different in me. And I don't want to spend my life stuck in a pattern, and I don't want to gain this world but lose what matters. So I've given up everything because I want to be different. I want to be changed. So all of me is gone, all that remains is a fire so bright the whole world can see that there's something different. So come and be different. Oh, I know that I am far from perfect, but through you the cross still says I'm worth it. So take this beating in my heart and come and finish what you started. When they see me, let them see you, 'cause I just want to be different. I want to be different, I want to be changed. Till all of me is gone, all that remains is a fire so bright the whole world can see that there's something different. So come and be different. I just want to be different. So could you be different in me? Well, thank you so much for joining us here this morning. Can we thank Margaret as well? She has a booth set out there in the atrium if you'd like to check out some of her books, including the new one, Taste and See. That'll be available for you out there as well. Thank you so much for being here. Have a great week. We hope to see you all next Sunday.